Hi, Isabelle. Thank you to be here.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, it's a real delight.
I'll start. I want to start talking about how did you start this Instagram account, talking about what you're trying to teach, just about a little bit about psychology, about mindfulness, about yoga. I want to know more. How is that you started to create this kind of knowledge and experience?
Yeah, for sure. So I'll give you the medium-sized version of kind of how I got to psychology. So about 6 years ago, I was actually studying law. I was living in London at the time, and I was studying corporate law. And I was pretty interested in the degree. Like I really loved it, and I was spending some time as well in a corporate law firm. And that didn't appeal to me so much. I hated wearing a suit, and I really didn't enjoy kind of the what felt like the rigidity of that life.
Mm-mm.
And I was practicing a lot of yoga at the time, and I kind of found myself more interested in my yoga classes than in my law classes. And I took 6 months off at the time and traveled to Australia to do my yoga teacher training, which was just with the idea of kind of with the idea of just developing my own practice and learning more about the practice. And I loved it so much that I stayed on and ended up teaching for a little bit of time. And I was meant to be going back to London to continue my career in corporate law. And I was feeling a little bit kind of tied down to that and constricted. And I remember at the time speaking to my mum and kind of saying, I don't want to do this. I would much prefer to kind of stay and teach yoga and develop that career. And I was tied to the corporate law job, so that wasn't really an option. And then, funnily enough, I mean, not funny for the business, but it's just funny how the world works, because then in December of 2016, that law firm actually went bankrupt, as in they collapsed
Oh my
in
god.
Europe and the Middle East, at least. So I lost that job, but it also meant that I kind of had a second chance to consider what I wanted to do.
How old were
And
you
I was
in
lucky.
there?
Sorry.
How old were you in that moment?
Ah, right. How old was I? I was, I think, just 24 at the time.
Mm.
Um, and yeah, so I kind of had a second chance to consider what I wanted to do. And luckily, it actually didn't take much consideration. I realized then that I'd always had psychology in my mind, and it was something I'd been really interested in. Especially when I was living in London, I'd lived with periods of kind of having intense anxiety as well.
Mm.
And it seemed to be something that a lot of people lived with, yet everyone had kind of different answers or different ways of dealing with it. And it really interested me kind of how there didn't seem to be much conversation around it. I think even now, today, it's already changing hugely. At the time, that was my experience. And it just made me all the more interested in it. So when that job in law fell through, I kind of had a second chance, and I went back to Amsterdam, which is where my family lives, and I started retraining in psychology. So I finished my bachelor's degree, and I've almost finished my master's as well now. And on the side, I kept on always teaching yoga, and I love that crossover, because I think a lot of psychologists kind of train to become classical psychotherapy kind of style clinical psychologist, which basically means they're sitting opposite someone or next to someone in a room, and there's a lot of talking, and that can be incredibly helpful. But and I would say for a lot of people, they need something more, which is also to be able to work with the body and the breath. So I really enjoyed being able to kind of to combine those things and to pass on some of what I was teaching in psychology within my yoga classes, and also to integrate some of the stuff I was learning about in yoga within my psychology. So there's a really beautiful crossover there, and there's a lot of people doing something in that space, which I think is great. And I continue teaching yoga, studying psychology, and then COVID hit last year. Of course, for every single yoga teacher, that changed their profession completely, and I was confronted with the kind of beast of social media, which I had been ignoring for most of my life. And I thought to myself, well, look, it's hard to be an active participant in this world today and not use it. And there's so many wonderful things about it. And I think, as with so many things, if we know how to use it as a tool, then it can really enrich our lives. So, I mean, I had to kind of train myself to think that way about it, but that's where I'm
Yeah.
getting to now. And I love it as a tool of um, kind of digesting what might seem like complicated concepts and ideas and practices into more manageable forms that people can take and really integrate into their own life. And that's something I'm really passionate about, is yeah, like making the stuff that I learn accessible to everyone, because it's not like I know all of these things and I'm sharing them because I'm some kind of amazing expert. I'm sharing them because I'm like, hey guys, whoa, I've just learned this and this is amazing. Like, we should all know about this. So it's my own learning process
Mm.
more than anything else, that Instagram account. And I've enjoyed that. So that was the kind of medium to long version of that story of how I got here.
It's cool. And it's interesting how you, um, you create that mix within psychotherapy and mindfulness practices or yoga. Would you say that do you mix it in the same context as a therapist, or do you practice them in their own fields? I mean, psychotherapy and in another situation doing yoga.
I think ideally, really kind of practicing them together. I would say the main constraint is that the yoga that I teach is group classes. So there's not really any possibility there of kind of doing more classical psychotherapy. I mean, you have group therapy, but it's not, it's not what people are coming to yoga class for. Um,
Mm,
but I have a few people that come to me for more private mindfulness sessions, and what I do there is I'm not trained as a clinical psychologist yet. I will be probably this year, but so in those sessions I use more what I've learned in psychology, but through the format of being a kind of mindfulness and yoga teacher, and I pass on breath and mindfulness practices, but it's more of a two-way conversation as well.
mm. It's pretty interesting how you said that. For example, therapy, it will be very great for a lot of people, and it is. But sometimes there's something more that we can do for ourselves, like right, like mindfulness. I think it's a great practice on how to be more aware of your feeling and your emotions, because are you going to say that you are feeling stressed or anxious even when you don't know how that feel? So I think
Yeah,
that's a great way to start to begin to be more like in touch with you, right?
absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And I think you're right. I think often, if we have spent a lot of time teaching yoga, or we're very kind of interested in mental health ourselves, um, we might forget that for some people, it might be so overwhelming to even feel into their own bodies, that we might be talking about experiencing certain emotions in a psychotherapy session, but they might have absolutely no idea how that feels. And that is kind of what I alluded to earlier as well when I said, for a lot of people, like, the vocabulary, the conversation isn't even there. We're so far away from even being able to talk about mental health in a way that we can articulate ourselves clearly, and yeah, we can kind of help people to understand how we're doing. And I think that that's a really important point as well, because I think at the end of the day, you know, my job in teaching yoga or eventually in psychotherapy is not to kind of fix someone or to tell them what it is they have, but to facilitate a process and to give them the
Mm,
tools to understand for themselves. um because how I experience sadness in my body might not be how someone else experiences sadness in their body, and
mm.
who am I even to say that something makes someone feel sad? So I think, yeah, it's the nice empowering thing about a yoga practice is there is no right or wrong answer. It's so much about it is about exploration and kind of exploring how you experience things in your body, um, and just facilitating that and creating the space for that, and is a first important step in helping people manage their own mental health.
Have you ever had the experience yet to to help up someone through a conversation, maybe through a therapy session, and see the changes, or after a few sessions you start to see the changes? How does that feel? How do you start to recognize that what are you actually understanding about mental health is starting to just see the benefits of what you're doing?
Right. Yeah. That's a great question. Well, I think, in yoga classes, which is where I've had more experience, I would say a big thing which I really always enjoy seeing is, as I mentioned before, offering a lot of freedom for exploration and for people to kind of do their own thing in their practice. So when I see a big change is when people in time start to just go off and do their own thing in a practice, so maybe they're ignoring what I'm saying and they're staying longer in one pose, or they're skipping a pose, or they're just resting and lying down on their backs. And that for me is always a really wonderful shift to see, because my favorite classes where no one's doing what I'm saying, but everyone's doing 20 different things. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but
Mm-hmm.
where like people are kind of able to be in tune with their own bodies and um, follow their like physical intuition, as opposed to an instruction coming from me who doesn't know what's going on in their body. So that's something that I always really enjoy seeing in that space. And I think there's so much research coming out now and has been around introspection, which is basically put the ability for someone to feel accurately into their own bodies and to kind of translate the sensations that are going on. And there's so much research coming out now about how that has huge benefits for our mental health when you're able to do that well. And so
Mm.
when I see people kind of going off and doing their own thing, to me, that's great, because first of all, not only have they been able to kind of translate those sensations and feel them accurately, but they then also have the sense of agency or self efficacy, we also say in yoga, to be able to then make decisions based on that.
Mm. What drives you to study psychology as a complement, maybe, of what you were doing right now? And I mean, why don't you study maybe more something more related to mindfulness practices? Because there are a lot. It's not necessarily the lens through the lenses of clinical psychology that you can study mindfulness meditation. But what drives you to study something more like a science, right? The science behind that.
Yeah, that's a great question. Look, I think we live in the Western world. We live in a like science dominant world, and the language that is spoken in healthcare systems is an evidence based language, which basically just means things have to be evidence based for them to be integrated in a kind of formal way into a healthcare system,
Mm,
which I think at the end of the day, overall is a good thing. Like anything else, it has drawbacks and it has benefits. It's the language we've been given and it's the system we live in, and psychology works within that system. So for things to be taught in a psychology degree, they have to be evidence based, which, you know, the golden standard of which is placebo controlled double blind trials. And for things to be applied in therapy, mostly they're evidence based. For things to be paid for by an insurance company, mostly they have to be evidence based.
mm,
And I think, it is the language that we've been given, and it helps people to trust things if they haven't had an experience with it yet. And maybe if they don't, know exactly what someone is offering, it helps them to trust that offering.
mm,
And there was definitely a point at which I was considering, I could continue just to develop myself in yoga, maybe do some kind of coaching courses, and mindfulness courses. And, a lot of that is evidence based now too. So, not to say that it's not, because there's lots of people doing wonderful research in those areas. But psychology is like, it's rooted in an evidence based system, in like a Western scientific system. So I chose consciously to do the psychology degree because it just opens so many more doors and it helps so many more people trust what you're offering, because it's not just me and my experience and the fact that it helped me and lots of students that I know, but it's been kind of supported by scientific research.
mm,
So that's why I chose to go down that kind of scientific psychology route, while continuing to integrate practices that maybe aren't as evidence based yet, or aren't evidence based, but I have experience in, but really making the kind of bread and butter of what I do evidence based practices.
mm. And are you thinking in getting a specialization on maybe any kind of therapy that you would like to study as a clinical consultant, as a clinical psychologist? I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, I'm naturally more drawn towards kind of somatic, so like body based therapies, or DBT is a style of therapy that kind of integrates more naturally, more mindfulness. So those styles of therapy are interesting to me because they kind of already have that crossover with yoga and mindfulness, which I already have a basis in.
Can you explain me more about that DBT? I've heard about that, but I'm not that sure.
Yeah, sure. I mean, from what my memory serves me off the top of my head, it's was created by a woman, Marsha Linehan, and she created it, if I'm correct, mainly for bipolar disorders. And it's a very kind of comprehensive style of therapy that involves um, yeah, different kind of mindfulness practices, also a lot of kind of acceptance practices. So there's a lot around the kind of mindset that you bring to the thoughts that you have,
Mm. It's interesting, right? How
if
how
that makes
many
sense.
how many studies are like making a progress in the knowledge that a lot of um, cultures and rituals that we have like studied from for example from Buddhism, and right now we are just taking a tip of what they thought, and we are making a progress on that, and we are starting to see that there's a connection, a physical connection between the body and how we feel, and the mind, and there's a lot of these cultures and mythics, you will say, that right now are becoming science, right? And we have more like evidence, as you said, that this works.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's so interesting and also really wonderful, I think, to see that many different practices and cultures and traditions have um, physical rituals, or sometimes breathing rituals, or rituals of community, that I suppose through trial and error they integrated into their culture and were really supportive to mental health and to community. And now, kind of Western science is finding the mechanisms of action and is uh, finding evidence to support those rituals and practices. And often, they're even very similar across cultures and traditions. And I think it's such a wonderful thing. And I think, having the Western, I think it can be difficult sometimes for, you know, if we're getting into an area of kind of taking practices from different cultures and applying them, like the bits that we kind of want to apply. There is that element which needs to be considered. But I also think it can really enrich the practices, knowing the mechanisms of action, and knowing how, and sometimes even very specifically why they work. I think that just can enrich the practices, and it doesn't have to kind of diminish them at all.
Yeah, I mean, maybe this it's all because we want to create a better way to just help people. So if we study more and we know more, and we can just start to study our own beliefs of what worked before and what could work better in the future. That's why I think it's better to just improve always this kind of knowledge, of how we understand the mind, and how we see the problems that we have. For example, you said that I am not trying to fix someone. I'm trying to be the facilitator, right? To help someone that help them, as their own way, right? Um, but sometimes there are like a damage, right? That you can have a physical damage, like a trauma, for example, that it's more difficult to fix. And right now, for example, I don't know what are the best ways to do it in to release someone that is not maybe not having a complex trauma, but maybe we all deal with a lot of difficulties in our lives, and sometimes there are too much for us, and we don't know how to relieve it, right? And I think that's a huge way to find an answer.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're right. I think, everyone, to greater or lesser extent, has some form of trauma or disconnection from parts of themselves. And I think, that kind of makes me think as well of something that I always think is really important that we talk about when we talk about mental health, is that um, it's not that you're either mentally well or you're mentally unhealthy. It's not, like you're either sick or you're healthy, but it's a continuum. And in the same way that you might have, when we talk about physical health, it might be a continuum. So you might have someone who, has diabetes, but is a really healthy person, and because they feel really healthy, and they integrate practices into their life that keep them physically healthy. They exercise and they eat well. Um, at the same time, you might have someone who doesn't have any chronic conditions, say, uh, and doesn't take care of themselves as much, doesn't have much energy, um, and doesn't feel themselves to be physically healthy. And I think it's the same thing when we talk about mental health, whether or not you associate with a diagnosis of a depressive disorder or a more chronic type of personality disorder, you can still, and you are still on a spectrum of mental health where some days or some months or years you might feel more mentally healthy and other times you might feel more unhealthy. And I think it's a much more kind of empowering way to look at mental health because the underlying condition, sure, that's something that you might need to go see a psychotherapist for, or it might be something that you might take medication for in certain instances. But that kind of continuum on which we all lie on, that's something that you can learn to manage yourself to some extent, in the same way that our physical health, we might live in a really polluted city and that's something we can't do anything about. And it's the same with our mental
Mm,
health. We might live in a really stressful environment and it's not always something we can change, but there are things that are within our control. And by shifting those things within our control, we can see clearly, first of all, where we are on that continuum. And that kind of feeds back into what we were talking about earlier with perceiving clearly the signals in your body, and then respond to that with practices that we've developed with or without help of a teacher.
that's very interesting. How many years did you study psychology, or are you keep studying today?
So this is my fourth year now. So I had 3 years of a bachelor, and I'm just finishing off the first year of my master's degree.
Okay, and how many years it does it take your master degree?
Oh, look, it's self-paced, which means it takes however many years I take to complete it, basically.
Hmm.
It's through like an open university, which means that I get to kind of complete modules as I go along. Yeah, but I'm hoping to finish this calendar year, so 2021.
2021. So
Yeah.
you will say that maybe in 4 years, someone can become a psychologist in Europe, for example, because here it takes you like 7 years or 6 years.
Um,
Yeah.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think that's something that hopefully someday, I don't know if it'll be my lifetime, but one day there'll be a kind of mutual recognition of healthcare degrees between different countries, because it's impossible to answer that question for I think even Europe in general. In the Netherlands, yes, in 4 years you can be a basic like basis psycholog, which is like a basic psychologist, but even then that's like very much the first tier, and then you keep studying and you keep getting different qualifications and
Mm.
moving along. And here in Australia, for instance, it's different again. um, it's up to, I think, 6 years. Having said that, I actually did study some psychology before as well, so in total I've done more like 5 or 6 years. But the average length of education to become a psychologist in the Netherlands is 4 to 5 years.
Mm. So you said that that even there, I think here in Peru or maybe in Latin America, there are a lot of this like people is ashamed to say I want to go to the doctor or to psychotherapy. um I am aware that maybe this happen in every part of the world. I don't know what are the difference, maybe in how much people believe in science or psychotherapy in different countries. But how someone can say I need to talk with someone, and it's a different talking, because it's not like when you talk with your friends or your parents and you are asking like an advice. It's a different, right? So how when do you realize that this is the moment to talk with someone?
Hmm, that's a great question. I think there's the kind of scientific answer, which for most countries would be most countries follow the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and it's the kind of Bible of psychology that has all these um, classifications in it of different symptoms, and the symptoms are grouped under a diagnosis. So from that paradigm, from that perspective, the answer would be, maybe when you fall within a diagnosis, so when you have major depressive disorder, that would be the time to go and speak to someone. um, Personally, I think it can be helpful. I think it's a little narrow minded as a view on, when to go and seek help in terms of a psychologist. Personally, I like to think that the first thing that we have to do is define mental health for ourselves. So
Mm,
what does it feel like for you to be mentally healthy? And that can be different to different people. As I said before, what it means to be healthy for someone who has type 1 diabetes looks different to what it is to be healthy for someone without, or what it is to be healthy for someone that maybe has lost a limb looks different to someone who hasn't. And
mm.
the same goes for mental health. And I think, you know, when you are not able to live towards a kind of mentally healthy place using the resources that you have, using the skills that you have, that's would be a great place to go, or a great time to go and see a psychologist. So, if you feel like you've been trying everything that's within your knowledge, within your practices, within your resources to achieve, and I use achieve here like very broadly, not like kind of success paradigm achievement, but to live in a way that feels aligned with yourself. Um, and when that's not working, that's the time to go and speak to someone, I would say.
That's huge. That the first step that we need to do is define what's mental health. Um,
Yeah.
and that's appropriate because, for example, when you see a lot of successful people, they have a lot of money, but maybe you can see around a lot of them that they suffer inside, or maybe you will see it not within them, but when you see, for example, how they treat to people, how they treat their families, or how they treat themselves, right? So you see, are they healthy? Maybe they are rich, maybe they have skills, but how would you will say that these people is living healthy, and it's not like maybe a cope of trying to s- to to compensate something in their lives.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's a great question. And, I think um, there's nothing wrong with being rich, and there's nothing wrong with being incredibly successful. And I think there will be so many very successful rich people who are incredibly mentally healthy and feel very mentally healthy. Um, I think the uh, the one thing I would say is that I think in order to define mental health for ourselves, I do think we need some degree, some space and time for reflection,
Mm.
because it's not something that, I think comes to us when we're running from one meeting to the next. So I think if someone has space and time to reflect on their values and their priorities and where they want to be spending their energy and time, because I think that's such an important part of feeling mentally healthy, is an alignment between where we want to be putting our energy and where we are putting our energy. And if someone is doing that, even within an incredibly stressful career, then great. That's great. That means they have found a kind of life that works for them and makes them feel mentally healthy.
Mm.
Now, I think it's hard. Like I think you have to have a pretty strong constitution to live a very high pressured life and feel mentally healthy, but some people are able to do it. Um, yeah, so that would be kind of my thoughts on that.
I think that that's where mindfulness comes, because it's a great tool that can apply to anyone, and not just because when you have, for example, mental health problems, because psychology is growing so fast that it's not just because it's not just for the people that has mental problems. There's a newest way a newest way of study field of study of psychology that is more related to how we improve, not just fix our problems, just only to improve, to be better, maybe to perform better, to be more focused, to know us more, and to just be more happy too. I don't think I think that's positive psychology. I'm not sure that, but there's a lot of new spaces where psychology is more than just fixing mental health, and is starting to see as a way of how we improve ourselves too.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I would say though that they're not separate, I think, and I
Mm.
think they shouldn't be separate. The psychology that focuses on whether or not you've got a mental health disorder or not, versus positive psychology, because I think they interact, and people, a lot of people will deal with both. Someone that has a substance abuse disorder, which is defined as a mental health disorder, also, while kind of learning to manage that, and once they've learned maybe to manage that, will also, I'm sure, be interested in how to reach their own full potential, and how to live in a way that they feel they're getting the most out of the kind of type of life that they want. So I don't necessarily think that they're separate things.
Yeah.
Clinical psychology and positive psychology, they are at the moment, and they're taught in that way. um, but I think ideally they will kind of come together and be offered in the same practice, in the same sphere.
Yeah, I would love to see more people going to psychology or therapies. Not just because they can handle their own situations, but maybe because they have new challenges in their lives, and they need maybe a new way to approach them. And
Yeah.
sometimes there's good answers on psychology. I found a lot of ways, for example, how to be more compassionate about something. And it's not like I need to be compassionate to be well, to be healthy. It's not like a priority, but it's very great for society when you start to develop those skills, those emotional skills, like being empathy, being compassionate. And I think there's no need to do that, only if I don't know how do you develop that sense of trying to be more connected with people. But I think that's one of the most beautiful things I've learned in psychology.
Yeah, I think that that is beautiful. You're right. And I would disagree though with you in the point that you said that it's maybe not necessary to be mentally healthy. I think, in fact, for me, and again, that's okay. Like our definitions of mental health can be different, but for me, I think compassion towards oneself, and it extends towards others,
Mm.
is really such a fundamental pillar of what it is to be mentally healthy. And I think that without that kind of attitude of compassion towards oneself, and it kind of quite naturally extends towards other people, um, it it's it's difficult to treat yourself in a way that supports mental health, in my experience. And it's
Mm.
something I struggle with a lot, is uh, kind of critical self-talk, as do
Yeah.
so many of us. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it is difficult to handle that inner critic. that sometimes is
Yeah.
difficult to handle with.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Have you ever heard about self therapy? It's a book about trying to. It's about related to internal family system. That's the name, internal family system, and it's the theory behind that our conscious is formed by a lot of different roles. Like for example, my father has a role in my mind, my mother has a role in my like a protector, right? So there's a lot of people in my conscious that they are all trying to deal with my conscious moment, the moment where I am consciously aware. And sometimes we are all in self, and that moment is when we are centered, we are compassionate, we are calm, even curious. And the idea behind that is that you try to, through self therapy, through internal family system, you start to learn how to talk with these parts and these difficult parts that don't want to work together, right?
Mm. Yeah, I love that. I love the internal family system stuff, and I really like referring to like parts of ourselves. I think it's
Mm,
such a nice, like, accepting way of speaking about ourselves, and I love, using that in language when I'm speaking with my partner or whoever it might be. It's a beautiful way to acknowledge that we do have these internal conflicts without pushing any one particular part away, and also acknowledging that sometimes, we don't like some parts of ourselves, and
mm,
just because we're moving towards accepting all parts, we don't have to love that they're there. And that's okay. And that kind of, yeah, I love the language of parts. It's really helpful,
yeah.
yeah, in that way.
It is it helped me a lot. It helped me a lot.
Mhm.
It developed me the feeling of knowing that there are a lot of parts that maybe even I don't like within myself, and maybe there are a lot of parts that I don't like in people too, because
Yeah.
I don't hate people in general. I hate people when they act in a specific way, when they are selfish, when they are, I don't know, when they are mean. But
Mm.
it's not that we help the whole person. We hate the specific moment when people are acting bad. So that's a compassionate way to see that there are parts, not people, just parts in a person that needs that attention, that seeks that attention to heal and to be more centered as a whole self.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's so that's such a good point as well. Yeah, I think, and also to remember that just as we have parts in ourselves maybe that we don't like, and sometimes we find ourselves rejecting or pushing away those parts, in the same way other people will have exactly the same thing. Any person that we meet in our day-to-day lives is having those internal conflicts as well with parts of themselves. And yeah, that is one of the ways in which we can extend compassion also, from parts to ourselves to others as well, and the way they interact with their parts.
Mm. Uh, we are finishing to the hour, but I want to have maybe a last question that it will be great for me at least. What you will say it's the most fulfilling thing that you do in your practice of mindfulness or yoga or psychology, because they're all like a little bit mixed, right? Because you're helping
Mhm.
people. So uh, I would love to know what's the most fulfilling thing that you do in your practices.
Mm. Sorry, let me just close that door. There's a school next door. I would say it's kind of a byproduct of the practice of yoga and even, some mindfulness groups that I've had. I would say that at the end of the day, the thing I keep coming back to that's the most important is actually just like community and the practice of interacting with other people. And I think that's something that's really come out over the last year. And realizing that actually, I think, a lot of the benefits that comes from coming together in a yoga class or coming together in a meditation class um, comes from just coming together in community. And kind of that is something I've also been developing more in my mindfulness practice by really focusing on the metta practices, which is a Buddhist practice where you extend feelings of compassion or loving kindness, first towards yourself and then towards other people.
Mm,
Um, so, yeah, I think, at the end of the day, the individual practices are all really wonderful, but if they're not having an impact on how we interact with the world and the people in it, then to me they've kind of lost their purpose.
mm,
um so it's a little bit of a kind of, I realize it's not exactly an answer in the
mm,
terms of how you were asking it, but I do think it's really important to keep in mind, because we can get so focused on you know finding mental balance and mental ease, and it is so important, and it's such a good thing to be focusing on, and finding those self-care practices and nourishing ourselves. But if we're not then taking that and finding ways in which we can be of service and we can support other people, then and also just enjoy the connections with other people, because it's
yeah,
nice to be out
it
and be
is.
engaging with other people, then why are we doing it? Yeah.
We are social creatures. We need that. We need that connection, that bond, that love that make us
Yeah.
feel better and happy.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your time. I really like it. You inspire me a little bit to keep trying to go to this direction of study, maybe psychology career, maybe a new one, or maybe just a specialization. I'm studying that. I'm looking for that answer, but I'm very happy to talk to you because I like to talk about these stuffs. That's one of the things I want to do. As you said at the beginning, trying uh, to share those things that maybe helped you, and you think that maybe it will be better for people to know them because they can help them too.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Well, I'm so glad you enjoyed it, and I really enjoyed it so much too. And yeah, if you have any other questions in the future, just reach out.
Cool, cool. I will. Thank you very much. It's nice. It was not. It was nice to. It was nice to meet you. Sorry, my English is just improving, but thank you very much again. We'll see you soon.
Thank you. See you soon.